Welcome to the March 8th, 2022 regular meeting of the Policy and Services Committee. Can the clerk call the roll?
Chair Stone?
Here.
Councilmember Cormack? Here. Councilmember Tanaka?
Here.
All present.
Wonderful, thank you. And do we have any of the any members of the public who would like to address the Policy and Services Committee during the oral communications? You can talk about anything that is not on the agenda.
Doesn't look like we have anyone online or in person.
Okay, thank you. Then we will move to our first action item, which is the update and potential recommendations on pending state and federal legislation. So welcome to our lobbyists.
Hello, can you all hear me okay? I'm in the council chamber as well.
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you. Chantel Cotton Gaines, Deputy City Manager, the City of Palo Alto. This evening, we have colleagues from our state lobbyist firm, and I don't yet see our federal lobbyist team yet, so I will alert you if they pop on. But
Ms. Cotton Gaines, I apologize for interrupting, but I don't believe anyone can see you except me, so you might want to consider turning on your...
Okay, you get to stare at my masked nose.
Yeah,
there we go. Thank you, Councilmember Cormack. Choosing which audio input is a very fun experiment in person. So nonetheless, the item that is before you today is just to update the city or the committee on what's happening at the state level. We had information in your packet as well related to the federal, where they are with different programs at the federal level. So I can provide that update, but I will turn it over to Nicolo DeLuca and Andreas Ramirez from Townsend Public Affairs to give you an update of where the state is with the mini bill submitted now that the deadline has passed, some items of interest for the city. And if you have any questions, we can address those. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ms. Gaines. To the committee members, Nicolo DeLuca, Townsend Public Affairs. I'm a vice president, and of course, my awesome coworker, Andres Ramirez, senior associate, both out of our Sacramento office. We did submit a memo, which I'll sort of go through, and then as we do in past updates, happy to answer any questions you all may have. And so again, really do appreciate your time this evening. So doing a recap of January and February, and it's hard to believe that we're already into March. As you all know, starting on January 3rd, that was the kickoff of the two-year legislative session. Since it's a two-year session, there was a handful of bills that were still active that were heard back in January that you all might recall us discussing. One of them was AB 1400, which sought to create a state-funded single-payer healthcare system. That bill did not go forward, meaning it is not going to be active for the rest of this legislative year. There's a considerable amount of discussion and debate on it and what next steps could be. Assemblymember Calra has said that he is interested in bringing this bill back. Another bill that was also anticipated and discussed was Assembly Bill 854 from Assemblymember Lee, which sought to require property owners in rent control jurisdictions to hold onto their buildings for at least 5 years before invoking the Ellis Act. That bill did not move forward. So that's just kind of recap on some highly discussed bills. So now the fun. So February 18th was the deadline, as Ms. Gaines mentioned, for bills to be introduced. And right now we're looking at about 2,115 bills that are out, introduced for the 2022 session. The committee hearings are going to start up in the next few weeks. The Senate will be having committee hearings sooner because they've got less bills, and they've also waived the 30-day program, the 30-day wait for bills to be heard. So we're just starting. We're getting through the beginning of all the different bills that have been introduced, working closely with the city manager's office on bills to watch, on bills that we want to weigh in on, and bills to be aware of. We are having a meeting later on this week with Senator Becker about a potential public safety bill that they're considering that we want to give our feedback on. And we're also talking to other legislators to get a sense of where they're at. Once we have a more narrowed down list, like we've discussed in years past, we will work through the city manager's office to really make sure we're watching just sort of the key bills. Obviously, with over 2,000 bills, it could be overwhelming. So we want to make sure we're focused on bills that impact local government, climate resiliency, and things of that nature. So that's legislation. This evening, the governor did his state of the state, which also ties into the budget. Similar to last year, we've got another massive surplus, which is still kind of hard to wrap your brain around, but that's where we are. And on January 10th, the governor put forward what he's calling the California blueprint. We're looking at a total surplus, and it's going to grow. In the next 30 days, we'll have a better sense due to the quarterly reports. But we're looking at a surplus of around, I think it's about 45 billion. And of that 45 billion, there's about 20 billion that's discretionary. The governor clearly laid out his kind of 5 existential threats, which included addressing the COVID-19 crisis, the rising cost of living, which we were just discussing earlier about gas, homelessness, public safety, and then making investments in climate resiliency. Many of the governor's specific proposals are targeted for early action, which means they would be adopted before the normal budget process, which is in June. I'm just gonna do some quick high-level numbers. On COVID relief, the governor is proposing around 2.7 billion along testing, vaccine distribution, support for healthcare workers. Another high topic and a high focus of his is combating the climate crisis, where he's talking about 1.2 billion for forest health and 648 million to address wildfires. Homelessness, his proposal is around 2 billion, and some of it is about addressing encampments, but a lot of it's also about getting people off the streets and into shelters and treatment, which I will then get into later. And then he talked about, and then there's his proposals around 2 billion for housing. I'll talk about it now. The California, the care courts is what he's been discussing. He unveiled that last week, and it's a way to help with some of the mental health crises that we're seeing with people that are living on the streets. And it's a way of ensuring that services are provided, that there's a way to get some of the homeless that are mentally ill into treatment programs, job training and others. And the discussion is then if they are offered these services and they don't take it, then what? The then what part has not yet really been fleshed out because this is a proposal that was introduced last week, but it's going to be highly discussed. Counties have concerns based on how they handle some of these issues. Cities, of course, are impacted by homelessness and some of the mental health crises. So it's definitely a hot topic that's going to be addressed throughout the budget process and the legislative year. We'll make sure that you all are up to date on that. One other thing that I want to touch on too is also for transportation. The governor was proposing the overall transportation package of 9.1 billion, which has to do with some of the high-speed rail funding, transit and rail projects, local projects, zero-emission vehicles, and things of that nature. So that's really where we are on the budget and legislation. Budget hearings and subcommittee hearings have begun. They've been more informational. It's very helpful for us to hear where some of the legislators are and what some of their questions are, and then also to hear from the administration to some of the more nuts and bolts for their proposals. One more thing, and then happy to start wrapping this up. The governor has taken some early budget action. He signed 3 bills into law. One was on COVID relief, which transfers 150 million into the California Emergency Relief Fund to address some of the COVID related issues. Another one was as it relates to, of course, you've heard supplemental paid sick leave for COVID. And then there's another one that includes more funding for COVID mitigation, around 1.9 billion, which includes more testing, enhancing access to the vaccine, and supporting frontline workers. So with that said, happy to answer any questions you have. And then just one other issue is we're currently in the assembly, we're down 5 members, as you all may recall from December and January. We've had some members be appointed, whether to being on the bench or some members just stepping down for personal reasons or other opportunities. So in the assembly, out of the 80 members, right now, there's still 5 vacancies. So with that said, happy to answer any questions you all may have. And thank you very much.
And Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
I received information from our federal lobbyists that they will not be able to join us this evening, but I did want to share just a quick budget update at the federal level whenever you find it appropriate.
I think right now would be perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. So it is, I'm just reading this. So it's expected to be a shorter legislative week in Washington as Democrats prepare to attend their annual legislative retreat on the back half of the week starting tomorrow. Even with the planned retreat, all eyes are currently on the budget. As a reminder, we are currently under a continuing resolution through the end of this week, March 11th. There's a bipartisan agreement on the FY22 appropriations, but the final details are still being worked out. The Friday deadline will be hard to meet, which means another continuing resolution could be needed for a week or two, so still within the month of March. The final agreement is expected to have about $12 billion to $15 billion in aid and assistance to Ukraine, as well as $12 billion to $15 billion. I'm not sure what my first numbers were. In aid and assistance to Ukraine, as well as $15 billion for COVID-19 needs. The president's budget is expected to be released in the coming weeks, but a date is not yet firmly set. Of note there, the budget that is trying to be adopted is for the current fiscal year that we are in, and then they're talking about release for the subsequent FY23 budget. So just wanted to give you guys that information that's relevant to the earmarks that we submitted to the federal government. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Conn-Gaines and Mr. DeLuca. Let's go now to the public to see if we have any public comment on this item.
Sure, I don't see anyone online or in person.
Great, thank you. Then I will open it up to my colleagues for any questions, comments, motions. And okay, thank you. I was going to ask Councilmember Cormack to raise your hand on the iPad, so thank you. So Councilmember Cormack, go ahead.
Certainly. Thank you, Chair Stone. And thanks to our staff and our consultants for being here this evening. I'll just go in the order of the staff report. It looks slightly easier. And Ms. Cotton-Gaines, I appreciate the information about the additional federal bill on the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. I don't know what $15 per metric ton is in terms of the cost per gallon of gas. I did go click on that link, but I think I'd appreciate the next time the federal lobbyist participates in this, another 2 paragraphs that would help us understand the impact. It's possibly something that we'd really like to advocate for, but I need a little bit more information. Okay, Mr. DeLuca and Mr. Ramirez, hello. Nice to see you, even though it's still in little boxes.
Likewise.
Fundamentally, having gone through this a few times, and I certainly appreciate the attention paid to all of the individual bills, but I'm starting to feel like we should really be more focused on the money. So as I looked through the, nature-based solutions, $2.1 billion on packet page 10, right? We're looking to do a levy here, which, is going to be ahead of the game in terms of some of that. Homelessness, $2 billion. We have an application in for home key. What should we be thinking about in terms of getting, whatever our fair share is of the billions of dollars? How is there something we need to change in our strategy, and how can we help you?
Great question, Councilmember, and appreciate that. I don't think there's anything to change. And we've been working closely with the manager's office on a couple of things. One is identifying specific Palo Alto projects that we could put forward for direct allocation of state funding. And your city manager's office, they're great to work with. And we were talking about that today and last week and the week before. That goes under the guise of, hey, there's so much out there. It really makes no sense to not ask for it. Correct. As it relates to going forward, so again, the surplus is new. So what we do is we have biweekly check-ins with Ms. Gaines, and we talk about many, many different things. one of the things that we've been talking about are the budget hearings and what it's looking like for funding for next year, the year after, and the year after. I think it makes great sense to continue this strategy to ensure your specific projects will A, make sure they're eligible, B, look at the different legislative language and criteria to ensure that we're competitive, and then C, help push for those funds. Whether it's climate resiliency funding, whether it's transportation EV charging stations, whether it's open space, many different things. We agree with you on it's now greater focus on money than legislation. And Andres and I joke with some of our coworkers and others, it used to be the legislative session would go, January through October looking at bills. But now with this surplus, it's really 12 months out of the year and it's ongoing. So our recommendation is keep doing the strategy we're doing, working on specific projects to help put forward, whether to Assemblymember Berman or Senator Becker, but then also working with the different budget committees and subcommittees to ensure specific projects like Levy or maybe even grade separation or what have you are primed and ready to go based on the programs that are going to be out there. I will say that with so much money, this is what we saw last year, so much funding, a lot of the funding went to existing programs because they had to make sure the funding got out there as soon as possible. The good thing about existing programs is we know what's out there. We know what they've done over the years. But then there also could be opportunities to ensure maybe some of the company legislation, we call it trailer bill language, or regulations, maybe there's a tweak here or change there to ensure our projects are more competitive.
Okay, and then is there a role at all for us to participate in the budget hearings? I mean, I realize a lot of this happens, shall we say, behind the scenes, and that's what we have you for, but is there more of an active role that council or, members of the public, frankly, should be taking?
I think that there can definitely be a role for the council as a body as a whole to weigh in on certain proposals. As of right now, we're still waiting for some of those proposals to take shape.
Okay. And I do just want to make one point on, there's so many bills about open meetings and things like that. And I assume that we will, we don't need additional insight or thoughts there. But, given what's happened to, former Mayor Mariko Sayak, the council member in Los Gatos, and some of the other things, I'm particularly interested in supporting SB 110. I don't know enough about all of the details but from the overview and what I've read before, it is certainly concerning to see how this change in this environment can affect our ability to conduct our business. So that one I'm particularly interested in. And then I guess that the last part, the Taxpayer Protection and Government Accountability Act, would it make sense for us to do something more proactive? I mean, I see that the League of Cities is already opposing it, but is there something more we should do?
Yes. On that, we have seen the League has taken some positions, and we also know other municipalities and jurisdictions have done their own resolution too, which really serves more of a way of educating and informing your direct constituencies. So I think if there's a comfort level, by all means, it makes sense for the council to weigh in, opposing that. And Andres, any other thoughts on that? Because what I recall seeing are other municipalities or elected leaders weighing in.
Yeah, I think it's more than fair for Palo Alto as an individual municipality to weigh in, as Niccolo stated. That's kind of the trajectory in which this is going. And Madam Councilmember, I'd also like to just backtrack one. You had mentioned Senate Bill 1100. It's a bill by Senator Cortese. We actually met with the senator's office last week and had a little bit of a discussion, knowing that this is kind of, a pretty significant bill with all that has been going on as of late. I'll note that the author's office stated that one, they would love, to have as much municipal support as possible. They shared a fact sheet, sample letters that we can share for, overview and consideration. And in addition to that, they did mention that they are more than happy to take into consideration any suggestions on, things such as the definition of quote unquote willfully disruptive, or what really constitutes a disruptive or dangerous behavior in a public meeting. So I think this is all to say that the author's office, while they've put forward this bill that they strongly believe in, they're more than willing to take into consideration any suggested amendments to bolster it in the direction it's going, or if there are concerns, certainly they're also willing to hear those. So that's all to say that I agree, I think this is an important bill to at least weigh on. And so long as your colleagues on the subcommittee and the entire council feel the same, we're certainly happy, Nico and I, to draft up a letter or provide additional context that you might need to make an educated decision on how you want to proceed.
Thanks so much for that. And I guess then, Ms. Cotton Gaines, just my final question is, would we need a motion around some of these things I've been discussing, or, can staff just take this, or does the chair need to chat with the mayor? What's the best way to manage the next steps?
Yes, great question. I'm checking the legislative guidelines as well as we're speaking, because that's kind of where I know I have authority to write letters and to submit information. And so we surprisingly don't have anything in there about the open meeting specifically. So this item is set on the agenda where that could be a recommendation to council, and we can put that and any others that council or the committee has an interest in council giving us that authority. For the
Okay.
one about the taxpayer protection, if that falls closer into the revenue source protection, which I believe it does, I think we have legislative guideline coverage for that one.
Okay, well, I'll look forward to hearing what my colleagues have to say about maybe making, adding that to the list of things that we'd like to take a position on. And then I'll just reiterate, Mr. DeLuca, Mr. Ramirez, when you're ready for in-person visits, I don't think there's any substitute to having people, from our council come up and, and demonstrate how much we care about this. So thanks so much.
Absolutely.
We appreciate that. We're ready. Hunters and I are jumping at the bit to see people again. The assembly's gone back to in-person. The Senate's going back May 1st to in-person. So things are definitely kind of getting back to normal. Councilmember, one other thing you mentioned, home key. We've been
Yes.
working closely with the manager's office to push for the application that the city submitted jointly with the service provider. There's been, on the number side, there was $1.2 billion in home key for this year, and then next year another 1.2 billion for home key. So we've had conversations with the secretary who oversees the program managers and others, whereas the Bay Area is oversubscribed. There's also funding that's out there, so we're pushing to ensure that projects that are either on the wait list, which you all are, or others, make sure that the money trickles down to the people that submitted those applications, which include you all. So just wanted to highlight that.
And that's a perfect example of something we'd like to advocate for in person.
Perfect.
Thank you.
And on that note as well, just of letters we're preparing, we are preparing a letter related to our home key application, just as a follow-up, and requesting that hopefully it can move this round. And then also preparing a letter related to the budget surplus and just stating some of the needs that are very high level and ready to go for Palo Alto.
Great. And, it's just important for people to realize that Palo Alto has some of these same needs around, homelessness that other cities do, despite, our reputation as a city with more resources than average. All right, now that's really enough. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councilmember Cormack. Councilmember Tanaka, do you want to go?
I'll let you go next if you don't mind.
Okay, that's fine. All right, yeah, a few questions. Thanks again for presenting tonight, and it was a really helpful report and your presentation as well. I am curious. I mean, so this is their second year now with pretty large surplus, and I'm not sure if it was going on before that or not. But why does the state continue to have such massive surpluses? What's really contributing to that?
We've heard, great question. We've heard that due to COVID and some of the businesses and companies that are based in California and doing well, whether it's an Amazon or what have you, tech industry has been driving a lot of the millionaire tax funding. There was initially last year, there was funding that was coming in from the federal government to help offset some of the gaps, and then certain wage earners were just earning so much. Happy to look for more ideas and solutions, but that's a lot of what we heard was kind of COVID business driven, tech industry, and kind of the California entrepreneurial spirit, and some of the big wage earners that reside within California.
Okay, thanks. That makes sense, and at least good to hear that has been trickling to the state, and then hopefully being returned to services and into cities as well. And so I guess kind of on that point, I'm wondering if you can discuss a little more about the governor's proposed budget, and just in particular state funding for affordable housing. I think you said $2 billion right now is being allocated for affordable housing, but I'm wondering, can you just provide a little more detail as far as like how is that funding going to be distributed? Is that going to be given some of it to cities directly in order to actually produce affordable housing at the local level? Are we going to see it in the forms of tax credits, grants? Do we have that level of detail yet?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, council members. So the 2 billion, a lot of it's going for sustainable housing developments to existing programs. So competitive applications, existing programs. As an example, 500 million to the Infill Infrastructure Grant Program. It's a program that's been around since about mid-2000, which helps build out the infrastructure for housing. And that's primarily for affordable housing. So that's 500 million, we call it the IIG program. Then there's 300 million for the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Grant Program, which also helps pay for the housing and some of the transportation tied to housing to try to get people out of their cars. I think there's about 100 million he was proposing on state excess site development. And then there's also on the side of mixed income housing development loans. And then and that's about 200 million. There's about 100 million for mobile home park rehabilitation. So that's what the governor's proposing. I know the legislature would like to see more. There's an MHP program, multi-housing program for affordable housing that's been really successful over the years. That's an existing grant program. They have talked about tax credits, TCAC and SIDLAC. Those are tax credits that help affordable housing builders finance their programs. That's usually oversubscribed. There's a 4% tax credit, and I think a 10% tax credit. I know that those are favorites of the legislature. So in a nutshell, governor proposed around 200 billion. Most of it goes to existing programs that you need to apply for. Cities, counties, affordable housing developers. And then the legislature, I suspect, will weigh in with some of their priorities, which will be other funding programs. There's also, and then the tax credits. There's been discussions about preservation funding. It's a lot faster to preserve a building than it is to build. So definitely that's also being discussed too.
I think it's, Mr. Chair, if I may, I think it's important to really highlight what Nicola stated about this is everything we've presented on thus far, and that is in this write-up is once again based on the governor's January budget proposal. So as you know, right now all these informational hearings that we discussed are ongoing. The entire point is for the legislature and specifically the budget subcommittees to digest and understand what the governor has put forward, so that can inform their decision on a rebuttal or counter budget. And then with that, the governor can kind of formulate his May revise, which will, essentially be an updated version with some input from the legislature. And then subsequent to that, there will be some sort of consensus with the legislature's final budget bills, which will be consolidated, sent to the governor for his approval and signature. So it's, it's a multi-step process, but I think what Nicola mentioned again is key. Is that this is sort of the first iteration of many. And as he also highlighted, the legislature has indicated that they want to see more. And then, what is more, he described some of it, but there could also be additional, programs or funding allocations to things that have not yet been discussed. And those are things that I think in relatively short order over the coming weeks and month or two, we'll have a much better understanding of what might be the possibilities.
Great, thank you. That adds a lot of color to it. That's helpful. I mean, I do think it's incredibly inadequate, the funding that's being proposed. I think it was Councilmember Philseth, when he was talking about what would be needed to be able to meet the upcoming RENA allocations just for the Bay Area. And that, I think his calculations, I'm ballparking it here, is like around 460 billion, I think was his calculation for that. So I mean, it's just, I think it's frustrating for the state to continue to talk about housing. And when we're hearing one of the greatest surpluses that we've ever had, to really be putting such a small amount into it. I'm glad to see there's going to be funding for infrastructure needs around housing. That's critical. And that's something that cities really just don't have the funding to do ourselves. But at the end of the day, it seems like most of this going to existing programs. I don't see that much, at least from what I'm hearing, as far as providing cities the ability to really actually create some affordable housing ourselves, or really being able to see that happening on the ground. So I do hope maybe in discussions then with our legislatures to really be pushing that real desire and need for the funding piece.
Absolutely.
Couple other just smaller questions then. Is any of the 500 million for grade crossings in the governor's proposed budget, do we know if any of that's going to be accessible to cities?
Yeah, the grade separation funding should be. It should be. Traditionally, that's been a program for cities to apply for. All the grade SEP, all those goods movement, et cetera, absolutely.
Awesome. This on one of the open meetings proposed laws as well, AB 1795. Do you know, would that apply to both the public as well as participants, or is there another? And I guess I mean as far as like electeds or appointeds, the ability to continue to be able to host meetings virtually like we're doing tonight. I mean, I think Councilmember Tanaka made a good point right before we all logged in here about if we're trying to meet our GHG goals and all these other climate change goals. I mean, what better way to be able to promote greater telecommuting? And yet another one of those areas where the state seems to be saying, yeah, no, we want that goal, but no, we're going to do all this stuff to make that so much harder to achieve. So do we know, is there anything either in that law or any other proposed laws that might create, I guess that would be in a carve out from the Brown Act, or to be able to allow for that?
Anders, do you want to take that, or do you want me to take a crack at that?
Yeah, so at this moment in time, council member, I don't know off the top of my head as it relates to the ability of those legislative bodies to continue operating, remotely based on their discretion. I think my understanding, based on some conversation, there's the talk that there may be an intent in some of those bills, but in terms of the actual language explicitly stating that is permissible, I cannot tell you off the top of my head. So that's something, unless Nicola has something further, we can certainly go back, double check the actual bill text and read it, comprehensively. And if it's still not apparent, that's something we can inquire with either there's a couple authors that have some bills pertaining to the Brown Act and Bagley-Keene Act. And we're certainly more than happy to ask them, if not explicitly stated in the text, what the legislative intent is, and if they plan to make any amendments so that is possible.
Great. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I would say thank you, Andrew. That was a great answer.
Yes, it was. Thank you. I think getting that clarification would be great. And if not, maybe trying to push that idea. I mean, at least at the very least for subcommittees and commissions and all that to be able to continue to do this. I understand full council meetings. I do think we should be in person, but for all the other ones, it's just, this seems to be, I don't know why we would be such a progressive state and then say, no, we're not going to continue this. And then just two questions on some of the police reform. Are there any laws being proposed or any chatter at all that would modify the Department of Justice's the memo on police encryption?
As in radio encryption, that is something we're discussing with Senator Becker's office through the city manager's office to get a sense. There was an interest level on that. what's the exact details are to be determined, but that is something that we're having discussions with Senator Becker's office to get a greater sense of what they're considering, what their appetite is, and what have you.
Okay, so nothing currently proposed, but there are some discussions.
Correct.
Great, thank you. And then one final question for me. I do recall there being some discussion last year on binding arbitration reform for police officers at the state level. But I understand that didn't move forward. Is there anything advancing related to that issue this year?
I have not seen anything on that this year, though, whereas February 18th was the deadline to introduce bills. We've got until the end of March for what we call spot bills to be further fleshed out or filled out. So there could still be an opportunity, but not seen anything on that quite yet just for this year.
Okay, great, thank you. And yeah, those are my questions. I guess I already made most of my comments. I guess just kind of seconding what Council Member Cormack said as far as that, I'm forgetting the number of that, the bill number there on the open meetings one, but I do think that sounds like something that we would want to support, especially if it's not in our legislative guidelines.
And on the open meetings, are you interested in just sort of the support for legislation related to open meetings, or did you all want to be specific for that particular bill? Because I thought you also referenced another one, Councilmember Stone. I just want to see how broad the committee wants to push forward.
I mean, I would be supportive of the one, and again, sorry, I'm forgetting the number. If someone wants to remind me,
Okay.
the one that
SB 1100.
perfect. Thank you. SB 1100. Yeah, I'd be happy to support that as well as the one that Mr. Ramirez was talking about, supporting the one Mr. Ramirez and I were discussing with the,
1795. Okay.
yes, thank you, with the understanding that if it doesn't include the ability for these type of bodies to continue to meet virtually at a city's discretion, that we advocate for that.
Thank you.
No problem. Those are all mine. Councilmember Tanaka.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, guys, thank you for the rundown. I really appreciate it. So I guess the first thing I'll start off with is I realize we're just mainly on the state topics right now, but my one thought I have is about inflation. So, with the Trump administration, a lot of the blue states, especially California, end up paying a lot more taxes for individuals. And unfortunately, that wasn't rolled. I was hoping that would have been rolled back with the Biden administration, but it hasn't happened yet. So, one thought is with the surplus, maybe they should try to lower some of the taxes. So that's something that could help people because, as some of you guys know, I've been doing a lot of door knocking, and there's a lot of poor people who are being hurt by inflation right now. The food cost, I was just looking at the app, my Gas Buddy app just updated, $6.50 in Menlo Park for regular gas, right? It's almost $6.97 for premium, right? And I realize some of you guys have electric cars, so it doesn't bother you, but for people who can't afford electric cars, for the people who still drive gas cars, it's a lot of money. And the inflation tends to hurt the people on the lowest end of the socioeconomic ladder because they most of their compensation is in cash and most of their wealth is in cash versus, let's say, the really rich people, like you look at some of the CEOs, they get $1 salary and everything else in stock. So anyways, I think lowering the taxes would definitely help offset some of the inflation issue, especially given some of the impacts that happened during the Trump administration. And, I guess a lot of the blue states got kind of unfairly impacted. But the other thing to think about is, right now, the state's been lucky to get more federal dollars, but I don't know whether the state can actually count on that because, we have record high inflation right now. So it's unclear about how much more quantitative easing can the federal government do. I think I read somewhere something like 40% of the dollars in circulation have been printed in the past 2 years. As we have the sanctions on Russia I just wonder whether the amount of dollars coming from the federal government can continue coming. And so maybe we should be saving some of that money because I don't know how long the federal government can continue to do that without just having runaway inflation. And the other thought, of course, is right now we have a lot of supply constraints, right? There's only so much that can be produced, and as they're just adding more dollars to the economy, it just basically eroding people's earning power, right? It's eating away at everyone's ability to afford the cost of living increases. So I think that's something I've been thinking about just in terms of inflation. So this is more general comments about the state budget. In regards to the SB 953, with the recent ban of imports of Russia oil, I wonder, is this the right timing? So that's something to think about, because I wonder, speaking about the high gas prices, I wonder, what makes sense given the situation right now. In terms of remote participation, we are supposed to be Silicon Valley, and Palo Alto is supposed to be the epicenter of technology. So I have to completely agree with the chair here that for the sake of greenhouse gas, absolutely, right? I mean, think about of all the cars that are not driving to City Hall, but we're trying to be leaders, right, in climate change. And so I think we should really embrace technology. I think I saw there's about 2 or 3 or maybe 4 different kind of bills pending. So it's a little bit unclear to me as to which one's going to win. But I think in general, we want to direct the ability to do more remote meetings, because this is one of the greatest ways to actually save on greenhouse gas. Because I bet you most of the meetings in Palo Alto actually are for meetings, right? Probably. And so if we can encourage that, that would really help with our climate change goals. And anyone that doubts that there's climate change, just look at the drought that we're having, right? Like yesterday, there was a consent item on trying to make up for the drought. So, and the other thing about with everyone being on Zoom, well, first of all, I can see everyone's faces better. So, when everyone's in person and everyone's wearing masks, it's a little bit hard to know what people are thinking, right? But now with people on Zoom, you can actually see everyone's faces. So in some ways, it's a little bit more transparent, and and even more so, there's no side conversations, right? Because all we can do is talk on Zoom. So in some ways, it's way more transparent. So I think some of the things that would make it tougher to do remote meetings should be pushed back on. So I have to agree with the chair on that. And speaking about the drought, so I do wonder, and I don't know, there wasn't much detail about the spend on the drought, the California drought, but I think the whole Western United States is turning into a desert. And so I wonder if more investment is not needed for water storage, for desalination plants. It's harder and harder. The Sierra used to be the snowpack used to be a water storage, right? But as it gets warmer and warmer, it's harder and harder for that to be a water storage. So I just wonder if we need to think a little bit further ahead and invest more and account for the fact that this may be, they talk about 100-year plus drought type situation. And so, I mean, I read about the Colorado River, like it's becoming a little trickle now. So I think, maybe a lot more investment needs to happen in that area. And this investment takes a while to happen. So, so maybe the state should be thinking a bit about that because, we're already talking about some fairly draconian rationing that we're gonna have to do just even in our own city. So just to me, this seems like we should be investing some of this in that kind of infrastructure for the desertification of California. And then the other thing is, I think one thing I didn't see in the list of stuff, and I think it's really important, is I know a lot of businesses are moving out of California. So we know, for instance, Tesla was headquartered here in Palo Alto for many years, and they're moving to Austin, Texas, and Palantir moved to, I think, Colorado. And if you just look at our downtown, it's because of COVID, because of people moving out, there's a lot less businesses. Like I think Oracle's also moved, right? And HP, and there's a fairly long laundry list of companies that have moved out of California. And some of the people have been very vocal about the business environment, how tough it is, and we have a lot of needs in our state. And to me, it would seem that a lot of these businesses help pay for some of that stuff. And so we, when these businesses move to Texas or Colorado or other states, I don't think, or Florida, I don't think that's necessarily a good thing for us. So I think it would be nice to actually see some sort of, and it doesn't seem like there's too much in there, but something in there to, encourage entrepreneurship, something to encourage innovation and technology to be in our state, because we've been very fortunate with that. But as some of you guys might know, I'm a tech entrepreneur, so I do a lot of startup type stuff, and there's fewer and fewer companies being started in California, right? There's more and more being started in Florida, being started totally remotely, or I just worry about people look at the here and now, but you also have to look at what seeds are being planted now, because in 5-10 years these companies are going to grow up, but they may not grow up here in Silicon Valley anymore or California. So this deeply worries me in terms of the business environment, and a lot of people's interest in trying to stay in California or have the next company in California. So I think we need to be more aggressive in this area, because we're definitely seeing a flight of talent out of the state. So I don't think that's a good thing, but that's something I would like to see. I didn't see anything on the list of stuff talking about this, but to me, this is important. And then crime prevention. So I saw that there was some money going towards that. I think that's great. I think we need to have more. I think safety is really important. I think a lot of mayors have kind of done about face on like the importance of safety. And even in our city, we have some record high property crimes and some record high, crimes in other areas that, didn't used to happen in our city. So I think that's all good, but I think it's also important that not that there's money for it, but there's also that there's laws that the DAs can use to enforce the law and allow safety to happen, because in some places, I'm not necessarily saying in our city, but in some places, right, you see like Walgreens getting or the drugstores getting robbed every day, right? You watch these YouTube videos about people just picking up stuff from these retail stores and just walking right out, right? And nothing could stop them. And I don't think that's what we want in our state. Because it's for retailers, you can imagine how devastating. This is why there's been so many. Part of the reason why there's been a lot of retail closures is because they simply can't survive like in that kind of business environment. So I think we need the money, but we also need the laws that can be enforced, so that we have a safe environment for everyone. But anyways, thank you for the update. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, council member, appreciate all of that. I'll say more on the comment side and the comments you made. I think those are all well taken and noted by Nicolo and I. A couple of things I think both of us can certainly address right now. For what you brought up on the usage of, I know you had brought up overall usage of funds that the state has with money trickling down from the federal government and other sources. I'll note that while there is, with such a large surplus, there will be obviously large spending amounts. The governor's administration and others have committed this year to doing things such as paying down debt on state pensions, paying out debt to other states and or countries that we have borrowed from, so that those debts do not compound over time. Obviously, that would become a greater issue with inflation. So those things are going on, as opposed to just certainly, spending money on existing or new programs, which was a little bit more of the attitude last year. So there is a slightly more conservative attitude this year,
Sure.
However, still wanting to spend due to the surplus. On the point you made about the bill with regards to banning offshore drilling in California, I'll note that the impetus for the introduction of that bill was the oil spill in Orange County. So it is from an Orange County member. There hasn't been too much discussion that we've been involved in as to the merits of that bill or whether or not that has real legs in terms of moving through the policy process, but certainly, noted, and it's something we can keep our eye on. And then as it relates to, you noted water storage, and I think Nicolo might have some additional context on this, but one thing we can certainly say is that has been recognized by both houses of the legislature and the governor's administration. There's a realization that, water issues are no longer just kind of a Central California or Central Valley issue. It's starting to affect the Bay Area, deeper Southern California, even way up north, closer to the Oregon coast. So everyone has a vested interest in that. And as such, whether there's money in the governor's proposal for climate related projects, and that could lend itself to things such as water storage projects. But we've also seen pieces of legislation. There's actually a bond bill. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but essentially it does allocate several $1 billion for projects, and of some of them it could be water storage type projects. But certainly I think we'll see throughout the budget process, and as we noted earlier, the legislature is going to be putting forward their version of the budget. We'll likely see some more of what the overall appetite is for funding large scale projects that have to deal with water storage, water quality, water conveyance, because those are all things that are important in California. So I'm going to pause there and see if Nicola had anything.
I'll just say one thing and then we can move on. I want to respect the rest of your agenda. Having been in this field for quite some time, I recall when Governor Brown was around and we had some serious drought restrictions, even, concerns about obviously limiting when you can landscape, when you can fill up your pool, how it impacts our ag community. I think we're moving closer to that. So what we'll definitely do is add that topic to the agenda for the city and provide more updates as it relates to water conservation, what could be coming next and what have you.
Great, thank you guys for the feedback. One thing just about debt is we're in a 40-year high inflation, right? As you guys probably know, right? It's record high inflation. We haven't seen this since the 1980s. And actually, right, if for the debt that's fixed rate, I don't think we want to pay that off too quickly, right? Because that's cheaper, right? As inflation gets higher. But of course, variable debt that has a variable rate, of course, that's what the one we want to pay off. So hopefully that's what's happening. I don't know if it is or not, but hopefully that's what the state is doing.
Great, thank you. I don't want to go on to another round, but I will entertain motions. So Councilmember Cormack, do you have a motion that you'd like to make?
I wanted to offer a different perspective on the open meetings than my colleagues. I did not expect us to have such different positions.
Yeah, let's see if there's a motion, and then you can, if that is a motion, then you can respond. No, okay. No one wants to. Councilmember Cormack, did you want to make a motion for what you'd like, and then see if there's any second to it, or?
No, I really did raise my hand because I wanted to offer a different perspective on meetings as I sit here without you two and feel quite differently about what we should be advocating for. As an example, the use of electronic devices at the dais, and then also when people are remote and it's not visible what they're doing. So it's just in quite contrast to the comments that my colleagues made. Do we need a motion? What does staff expect from us this evening on this item?
It's at the pleasure of the committee. We wanted to make sure you all were up to speed on things that we're doing both for the state and the federal level. If there are pieces of legislation of interest that we don't feel are covered in the legislative guidelines, you're more than welcome to push forward a recommendation to council on those. And there seemed to be some interest around that SB 1100 bill related to the open or public meetings.
Right. Well, so just to be clear, though, with my colleagues, that SB 1100 is not about whether or not members of the elected body can participate remotely. It's about the orderly conduct during the meetings. So I'm not sure if you were all referring to the same thing. I'm certainly happy to make a motion to that effect. Do we direct staff to add something to the legislative guidelines, or do we recommend to council that they?
Yeah, it would be a recommendation to the city council to support or oppose legislation XXX. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think we want to continue to monitor as opposed to, within. Mr. DeLuca, thoughts on, because I know you had mentioned that they were interested in feedback.
Yeah, what we
on how to word this.
Absolutely. I think what would be helpful, this is helpful direction for Andres and I to speak to the author's office, get a sense of where they might be going on this bill, and just provide an open, informal conversation with them. Get back to Ms. Gaines about what could be coming down the pipeline or not. But I do think it makes sense for the city to weigh in based on exactly what you're saying, council member, about the way meetings should be conducted based on tone and tenor and respect and what have you.
And to add on to that as well, if the interest is for tracking the legislation and just having these conversations, I think we're fine in the world we're in to be able to do that. Just the conversations that Mr. DeLuca and Mr. Ramirez have at Sacramento folks. If the interest is for the city to officially weigh in, that's where I feel like we don't yet have the council direction to do so. Does that make sense as a small differentiator?
It certainly does. It certainly does. Okay, well then I would go ahead and make a motion. I'm so sorry to our clerk, but the main computer isn't working. So if you're going to type it up, presumably it'll be here on the iPad. It was direction to council. Yes. Okay. So recommend the city council investigate. It's not really investigate, right? Consider supporting SB 1100 to conduct orderly meetings. Leave that nice and broad. I'll see if there's a second.
Quick question, Ms. Cotton Gaines. Do we also need to just I'm looking at the staff report. Do we need to accept this this report in any way? Does that need to be included in the in our motion?
Formally, no, I don't think so. It's not, you can include that in the motion if you'd like, but this is more just update. So I don't think you have to make a formal accepting.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. I'll second the motion.
Thank you, Chair Stone. Shall I speak to it briefly?
Yes, please.
You know, here in our own local Bay Area, we've had really scary situations for elected officials and personal targeting of them and of their family. And it's really, in addition to that, prevented public meetings from continuing in an orderly fashion. So I think it is appropriate for us to support legislation that gives us additional tools to make sure that we can conduct the public's business in an orderly way without threat of violence.
Thank you, Councilmember Cormack. And yeah, I think you said it well, and a well-functioning democracy can't survive or perform well if we're not able to have respectful, orderly meetings. I think this is exactly what is needed right now. And a quick question then for our lobbyists back on, AB 1795. You don't need council direction to simply inquire into what was discussed tonight. You would just need council and get that clarification. You would need council direction to take a position on it, but not to be able to get that more informal feedback. Correct?
Correct.
Okay, I'm comfortable with that then at this point. All right, so there's a motion on the floor. Councilmember Tanaka, did you want to speak to it? Okay, not hearing anything then. Clerk's office can call the vote.
Councilmember Cormack,
Yes.
Councilmember Tanaka,
Yes.
Chair Stone,
Yes.
motion passes unanimously.
Great. Well, thank you, Mr. DeLuca. Thank you, Mr. Ramirez, for being here tonight. We appreciate the discussion. Looking forward to seeing you next time.
Our pleasure. Thanks for having us. Looking forward to it. And
Actually, Chair, hold on. I was going to make another motion.
Yep. Okay.
So just to the point of, and I thought it would be good for us to clarify this because I think we have Councilmember Cormack who maybe have a different perspective. But should we have something around the remote meetings at least should we talk about that a little more? I know Councilmember Cormack has a different opinion, but would this give staff some clarity around that?
If you want to make a motion, okay, I just don't want to have I'm concerned about having a prolonged discussion on it at this point since we're
Okay.
already past.
Okay,
8.
I'll make a brief motion. So I make a motion that we support and encourage our lobbyists to support the ability to have remote meetings. I'm not sure it needs to be more specific than that.
Yeah, I'll second it if we can get the language on there, maybe to try to.
And as a point of clarification, you don't have to have the encourage the lobbyist piece of it. If the council is doing it, the lobbyist would follow up with what the council directed.
I mean, I think for the reasons we talked about, I think it's actually more transparent and it helps with our greenhouse gas situation. But I think we want to embrace technology, but I don't know if that has to be in the motion per se, but those are my motivations behind this.
Yeah, and I'm supportive of this. I mean, I do think that I think individual cities should be able to make the determination of what works best in their own jurisdiction. We're not discussing this as what Palo Alto will do. This is what we think the state should allow other cities to do. And if other cities feel like this works better for them and their community, I think this is a tool that they should be able to have. And I think it's a little overly paternalistic of the state to try to be telling all the cities, this is how you need to run your meetings. It's clear we've been able to do this throughout the pandemic. I don't understand if it hasn't been good enough for the last 2 years. I don't see why we can't continue this. And I completely agree. I mean, if we're really working on greenhouse gas emissions, transportation, single occupancy vehicles, one of the greatest contributors to that, this seems like another tool that communities should be able to have to combat that. So that's why I'm supporting this. Councilmember Cormack, you want to speak to it?
Yes, please. Is the motion correct as shown on the screen?
Well, I think someone said we don't
need lobbyists.
Yeah, exactly.
So maybe just support and encourage remote
Legislation.
Yeah, legislation.
Sorry, so I think it's really lacking in clarity. Do you mean that council members can participate remotely? Do you mean that the public can participate
I
remotely?
think everyone should be able to participate.
Always.
Yeah. I think we should,
Yeah.
I think
So
I think
I
Chair
won't-
Stone,
I won't be supporting it.
Sorry, I'm just trying to figure out maybe how we can wordsmith this a little more, because I do agree it's a bit vague. It would be nice if we can improve, support, and encourage legislation for maybe support, and encourage legislation for all participants.
Yeah.
For all participants to
participate in meetings remotely.
Yes,
that's basically.
there you go.
Yeah.
I think that's good enough. I think that's clear enough. And when it gets to Councilman Tanaka and I can talk about it a little more.
Yeah.
And for a little bit of context as well, last year we did support, I believe, 2 bills that had to do with remote meetings. My computer just died right in front of me, so I can't pull them up, but one of them just allowed for the city to be able to continue this virtual or hybrid environment. So the city did support that, and one of the other bills did not move forward at all. But the one that's allowing us to do this hybrid atmosphere that we're in allowed for as long as there's a declared state of emergency, and then there's the monthly action, which I know that council is aware of. But I did want to express that the city has shown that support last year as the baseline of saying the flexibility that we've had during the pandemic, we would like to see that continue. So just for context of what we've done.
Yeah, so maybe that's a good point. Maybe it needs to say participate in remote meetings even during non-emergencies. Maybe that's what it needs to say.
That works for me. And thank you for that context. So also, I think good to know we do have some level of precedent for this. I know it is different, but something somewhat similar. Okay, great. Then if the clerk can call the vote.
Councilmember Tanaka,
Yes.
Councilmember Cormac,
No.
Chair Stone.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm not sure. With 2, does it pass?
Yes, it does.
Yes. Okay, motion passes.
Thank you. All right. Well, now that officially ends this item. Thank you again, Mr. DeLuca and Mr. Ramirez. Now
Thank you very much. We appreciate you
pleasure.
all. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
All right. Well, so now that brings us to item 2, Office of the City Auditor's presentation of the Economic Recovery Advisory Report.
Good evening, members of the Policy and Services Committee. Kyle O'Rourke, City Auditor, joining you this evening. Pleasure to be before you again today. Pretty quickly here, I'm going to turn over our report to members of the team. This is an audit that was approved roughly a year ago, actually, as part of our initial audit plan. We conducted some preliminary activities as the project started that led up to last year's budget season. So we did a quick look at sort of budgeting models, and then we picked up the process again a few months ago as the long-range financial plan was being developed. So this work is roughly a year in the making, with a little bit of a pause, 6 months or so in the middle, and we're happy to present the results of the report today, which is what you're seeing in front of you. I'm not sure actually who's sharing their PowerPoint, but I was planning to go to the next slide, and I'm happy to share if that would be administratively easier. There we go. So I'll go ahead and share, and as we transition to the team, just let me know when you want me to transition slides. It's an overview of sort of the executive summary, our purpose and structure of the analysis. So the purpose, we wanted to take a look at the long-range financial planning models and inputs with the intent of potentially identifying opportunities to improve modeling. That model, as you know, the LRFF, long-range financial forecast, is used for purposes of budgeting, for look into future year revenues and making long-term decisions. So we really wanted to take a look at the model and determine whether or not it was using best practice and the appropriate methods. The second item here is really to analyze the key revenue sources. So we took a look at the top revenue sources, not the full list of revenue sources, but the top categories. And then, as I mentioned, the starting point for this was to offer ad hoc advice during the budgeting process last fiscal year for this fiscal year's budget. So we worked with the administrative services team, did a quick look at the financial model at that time to offer input roughly a year ago. So the structure of the report, you actually have sort of 2 reports in front of you. You have what we're calling the Revenue Trends and Models Review. That's truly the report that we're planning to discuss today. The second report we're calling an Economic Resiliency Analysis. Just in the course of our review and leveraging some of the subject matter experts that were involved in the project, we compiled some somewhat useful economic information. And our intent really with this report, we're not making any recommendations, but it's to pass it along to the city manager's office and the future economic development manager, just as an input as that person starts. But really the critical piece of this, and where we do make recommendations, is in the revenue trends and models review. I'm going to turn it over to a team member, but before I do that, I just really wanted to recognize the efforts of the Administrative Services Department, in particular, Ms. Noze and Ms. Paras, who are joining today. Ms. Paras, in particular, and her team were heavily involved in the day-to-day delivery of this work, and were a pleasure to work with for our team. So kudos and thank you to them. Peter, I'll go ahead and transition to you. Just let me know how you'd like me to work through the slides.
All right, you can go to the next slide, Kyle. Thank you. And for those of you who I haven't met, which I believe I actually have met everybody on the phone, my name is Peter Haney. I'm a senior consultant on the team and a project manager for this audit in particular. And I do want to reiterate, Ms. Paras and the team were really, really great to work with. And we're not just being polite. They were a lot of help, and then also provided a lot of guidance throughout the process as well. So to give you a high level overview of what we had accomplished back in March of 2021, this is actually when we had started the preliminary analysis, which specifically took a look at working through the forecasting models and understanding some of the inputs and how all the forecasting models are structured. These specifically included property tax, sales tax, and TOT. Now, back in August, so a little bit after March of 2021, then we went through and included documentary transfer tax and UUT, utility user tax, in analysis as well to really review more than just the models, but also do a little bit of a data analysis. So that included property tax, sales tax, TOT, and then we included on PPT and UUT in there as well. Kyle, you can go to the next slide. So from a high level methodology standpoint, what we really first did was did a big information request, which the Administrative Services Department was really helpful in getting an understanding of what's all the current state of spreadsheets, models that exist, any other reference materials. We also conducted interviews and walkthroughs and did quite a thorough walkthrough of the models that we were looking at to the great patience of the Administrative Services Department. And so that was really helpful for us to be able to understand what's currently working in terms of the forecasting models. And then we also did some of our own independent research, both around state and national projections, and then did some research around economic indicators. We also relied on some of our own industry knowledge too from some of our previous clients. And then we had completed some various analysis, including statistical correlations, and we had about a dozen different factors that we analyzed, and you can find those in the report. And so the report itself, you'll be able to see the structure for all the different revenue sources are basically what's showed here on this slide. So first we go through the revenue source overview. This is just really high level, brief introduction on the revenue source. Then we go into a much deeper dive into the data analysis. So some of the observations and data analysis, including historical performance, historical averages, economic indicators. So those three are going to be consistent sections in all the different revenue sources. And then we go into a data interpretation section. So this is us taking a look and giving our opinion on what feels like a reasonable projection, what feels like an unreasonable projection, and how do we start to make some of those distinctions. And then also for property tax, sales tax, and TOT, we also include the current state model description, industry best practices, if there's anything that's worth noting outside of what's already being done, and then observations and recommendations as well. So to give you a quick example, we can go to the next slide here. This is actually a summary of a TOT, and this is just a quick example. I'm not going to go in depth here, but this is in the report, just essentially taking some of the factors and forecasting these out to 2040. If you were to take the different factors that might have had a higher correlation or some of the historical averages, and then also a linear projection as well. So this is just using this as an example. And then finally, I can go, Kyle, to the results and leave enough time for discussion here. But I guess the thing I'll say about the results is really the high level conclusion that we had is the forecasting methodology is pretty sound. It's logical. It aligns with a lot of the best practices we've seen with other clients. It aligns with the best practices that we did in our independent research. And so our recommendation section is relatively uneventful because of the fact that there really is a lot of good practices in place right now. So we were really happy to be able to see what's currently taking place. I think the things that are worth noting here, first, we had two recommendations specifically around workbook cleanliness and some of the process narrative around this. So the first is regarding the naming conventions and workbook narratives. So going through some of these walkthroughs, it required a lot of meetings to be able to understand how does information flow through workbooks. And so this is all very thorough information. It would just be helpful for not only the internal team, but also our team as well, to be able to have almost like a lead sheet up front in these workbooks to show where is this data coming from, where does it go to, what is the purpose of this workbook, and really have that information right up front. And then also in the naming conventions of the files themselves, being able to have that clearly laid out. And then the last piece too in the workbook process narrative and cleanliness area is also the notation of assumptions and guesstimates. So there's a couple of times in our review where there might have been figures by necessity that needed to be guesstimated. And so it's really just an assumption or a placeholder to be able to start scenario planning. And these estimates and figures oftentimes had very specific guesstimations, I guess. It really, you could see them go to the hundredth place, where if there's an estimate like that within the workbook, it should be called out specifically saying, hey, this is an estimate and this is why we're estimating it. This is what the reasoning why we're actually going with the number that we're going with. And then also it should be a little bit more generic than having to the 100th place. So it doesn't quite make as much sense from a guesstimate standpoint. Then the other thing I'll say too is the other recommendations that we had were a little bit more considerations around other indicators and factors in transient occupancy tax. So in transient occupancy tax, through our best practice research, there was a couple of different factors that were called out that weren't involved in the Palo Alto procedure. However, that's not necessarily a bad thing. So for one example, San Jose, they actually have conferences as an element that they forecast into their future TOT revenue projections. However, San Jose also has a big conference center, so it makes sense that they would be able to have more access to that information. Some of our recommendations are more around, are you able to have a relationship with Stanford where you start to understand what are some of the major events that are coming by? Can we start to expect increases in hotel guests and other factors, and that also goes back to sales tax as well. But some of these considerations are not so much hard and fast recommendations as in these are some of the things that are worth looking into. So with that, that's a high level overview of some of the results. I'll open it up to questions, discussion, comments from anyone on the call.
Great, thanks, Peter. Appreciate it. Before we go to council questions, let's first go to the public to see if there's any public comment.
Chair, there's no hands raised and we have no requests to speak in person.
All right, thank you very much. Then I'll open it to my colleagues. All right, Councilmember Cormack.
Thank you, Chair Stone. This was fascinating. It really was. We spend so much time on the long range financial forecast, and we are now in this quarterly mode of doing our work ever since the pandemic. And to have a moment to step back and have a different perspective on it, slightly different graphs, I found very helpful. I appreciate the auditor highlighting on page 12 the strengths of our team, and the page numbers I'm using, by the way, are packet pages because the other ones are too small for me to see. And then I guess my first question has to do with the forecasting accuracy on packet page 13. It looks like we consistently, with the exception of 2019, underestimate a bit. Are these ranges, asking the Baker Tilly team, that seem reasonable, consistent, great, terrible? How would you evaluate the forecast accuracy over these 5 years?
Councilmember Cormack, I failed to show my team the council packet pages, so they're probably
Ah,
pulling
oh,
that up.
7. It's 7. It's the first page of Introduction to City Financials. So it's page 7 of the Economic Recovery Advisory. I'm just going in order here.
Yes, so Peter and potentially Nick might have comments, but I think, you know, the general conclusion is that these are very good results. Deviations in the roughly 5% are to be expected. So these are certainly good results and represent, you know, solid forecasting methods.
Great. Did you want to
I would
add more,
agree.
Mr. Haney?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that the when you start to see things get wonky is 2020, and I think everybody can expect that that is reasonable.
Totally fair. I don't think we should evaluate anybody based on what they thought was going to happen in 2020.
Yeah.
I think the thing that was most interesting about this was the correlations analyses that you did, the list of things that you looked at. And as sort of I went through, I thought that was a real area for us to think about going forward. And staff may already do this work, but just to surface it and remind all of us that these correlations are, you know, specifically with personal income in Santa Clara County, which is not necessarily dependent on us. It just, I thought it was a really interesting lens to use. And I hope we do so going forward. So specifically, now I have to translate my pages for you. So page 19 in yours, 25 in ours, was looking at the correlation between TOT and sales tax. Does staff see that does our staff see that as something that's, of use to think about? Or do we already in ASD look at that?
Hi, Christine Paras, Assistant Director of Administrative Services. Yes, that is a correlation point that we do look at, especially with the past 2 economic downturns. There is, a definite relationship, and we try to model our revenues based on that.
Great. Okay, good to know. Then moving on to the TOT. Now I'm on packet page 30, which is your report, page 24. Interesting, and I guess it makes sense that the luxury hotels have a lower beta than the other segments. I think we tend to use the royal, we tend to say hotel tax as if it's a chunk of things, but thinking a little bit more about the segments, and not all of ours are, high end, but many are. I think that's a helpful way for us to think about changes, as we talk about recovery and transition. So really, really appreciated that thought. So I do appreciate, Mr. Haney, you talking about Stanford. It was very interesting to see that pop up as not usually a primary correlation, but another one. And I think the recommendation to have regular meetings with Stanford, not just about disasters and not just at the, the mayor and the president level, to the extent we aren't already doing that, not just specifically, really with Stanford Research Park, but with the university itself and the medical center, as we move forward out of this experience, I think that's incredibly important. I appreciate the recommendations. Now I'm on our page 41, which is going to be your page 35. And you're right. These are, I hesitate to call them minor recommendations, but they're not things of major concern. They're opportunities to improve already good practices is how I'm interpreting that. So I read those and I see that there's partial agreement. So I'm glad that you all had a discussion about that. And then finally, I realized, Mr. O'Rourke, you said, we weren't talking as much about the, okay, you had a funky name for it, resiliency plan, not the advisory. But I thought the location quotient was a helpful metric to look at. And it was great that you had, I don't know how to pronounce NAICS. Do we have like an acronym we call it now? Okay, we just spelled all out. NAICS data, both at the 2 and 6 digit level. I mean, we love our data here in Palo Alto. And I do appreciate all that in there. I think it will be very helpful for the economic development manager when that person arrives. So, how I'm thinking about the work that you did here, is it validated the approach that our staff uses and gave us opportunities to sort of, tweak and look at it through a slightly different lens. But I think this is very useful work, and I hope that it informs our conversations going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Tanaka, would you like to go, or I can go with some questions?
You can go.
Okay. All right, yeah, thank you for the report. As always, incredibly thorough and helpful. I just have a few follow-up questions here. So the report addressed concerns about long-term work from home models. I'm curious, how much of the norm do we think this will be as we emerge from the pandemic into more of an endemic? Do you foresee that continuing, or what kind of ongoing impact do you think that'll have?
Yeah, I can address this briefly, and then I'll pass it off to my colleague, Ms. Purdy. I think the big answer is we don't know. I think a lot of this is going to be a guess too, in terms of how much remote work is going to be an option for a lot of these companies that are in the area. Based on what we've seen so far, and even just based on anecdotal data, it sounds like that there's going to be quite an emphasis on remote work, if even just 2-3 days out of the week. So from that standpoint, it is a lot of speculation. And Marta, I'll let you talk about that as well if you do have any other additional comments, but that's my general thought there.
Yeah, good evening. I unfortunately agree that, I think a good approach is to keep in conversation with businesses and see what's happening, because really no one knows. Even the new CDC guidance that has changed everything this past week might change that remote work strategy. So I think the flexibility is probably here to stay, but what does that really mean? I don't think we know yet.
Fair enough. Thank you. One thing I found interesting, the report warned of decreasing real estate values, maybe in Palo Alto due to external factors. I'm curious, is there anything in particular that concern is based on? I mean, typically we see Palo Alto real estate values always appear to be constantly on the rise, even through the various recessions we've seen over the last quarter of a century. So is there anything in particular that is that gave you that concern?
Yeah, and Councilmember Stone, do you have a specific reference by any chance of where you saw that?
Let me see if I can.
And I can speak briefly, just from general thoughts here too, because if not, that's okay. I think
on page 5, I believe, of your report, not the staff report.
Gotcha. So I think one of the big pieces too is understanding what starts happening when a lot of these homes go for sale, and then with Prop 13, what happens then when these values get reassessed. So not so much that the home values themselves will decline, but from the revenue standpoint, if these homes are going to be sold, and then at some point the city has caught up on being able to collect the most recent values, then what happens with those revenues moving forward? Does it start to plateau off? I believe, and apologies, I haven't actually gotten to page 5 to see if the specific reference, but.
Yeah, well, you mentioned that you talked about the Prop 13. That's actually the bullet point right below what I'm curious about. Right above it, it says, decreasing real estate values due to external factors decreases city revenues from property taxes. And I'm just wondering why there's a concern of decreasing real estate values.
Yeah, and I think so maybe the Prop 13 piece is a bigger piece of that as well. If there is decreasing real estate values, I know some of the factors that might be playing into that too is if there are businesses that decrease or that move out of Palo Alto, if there are a greater amount of residents who are moving out of the state of California if that population trend starts to continue.
Okay, yeah, okay, that can make sense if we're seeing an exodus of jobs and major corporations, and I guess that brings me to to sort of a question, but also a thought. I mean, the report does mention there's also concern over corporate headquarters moving out of state. But there's also been in the news lately talk of some local tech giants kind of really considering some massive expansions in the region as well. I don't know if you saw, I think it was last week, the new Intel CEO has been talking about plans to really position Intel as essentially the next Apple in terms of rapid growth. And so I would imagine if Intel is successful in that, we're going to see a whole nother wave of new senior executives and employees seeking housing opportunities along the peninsula and here in Palo Alto. And so I would think I'm curious to see if that will offset some of the other firms exiting while other tech firms consider actually growing.
Councilmember Stone, just to clarify, it took me a moment to get to this section, but the section you're referring to with the risk of decreasing real estate values in the introductory part, this is one component of the risk assessment that actually led us to conduct the audit activity to begin with. And these are sort of anecdotal thoughts that are shared with us during the risk assessment. So, Peter kind of went through what those anecdotal thoughts were, but I don't know that we have specific evidence to suggest that is happening, will be happening imminently. Just something that, I know folks were concerned about, particularly last year when we conducted the risk assessment. That was the point in time when there were news articles, around Tesla and other companies leaving California.
Good. That makes me feel better. Thank you. So, okay. So it was more of a thought and a concern, but your investigation didn't really reveal any actual proof of that happening.
Well, I think this is Nick Dragish. As I recall, we had a report from the Hoover Institute that talked about the impact of businesses leaving California. And that came up during the course of the study, which caused us to have some concern about what that impact might be on future property values. Again, it's fairly speculative, but combine the news articles with the report from the Hoover Institute, put this thought in our mind that there was potentially this risk.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, and I think that's something definitely that people on the peninsula are concerned about, as well as Palo Altans. Be interesting to see what happens there. But I again, interesting kind of what it seems like sort of a natural ebb and flow, and companies leaving as well as new ones coming in, starting or even expanding, like Intel is planning to do. So, but thanks for that. Thanks for that clarification. Just a couple of other questions. One that kind of surprised me a little bit was the TOT projections being based in part on Santa Clara County's personal income and population. And so why is that? I just wouldn't think that kind of our projections for our own TOT projections would correlate with like the county's personal income and population, given that hotels are going to be typically visited by out of towners. So why is that?
I'll pass it off to either Isaac or Nick in a little bit here. I think one of the pieces to keep in mind too is that the personal income, the correlation is actually a lot less in the TOT category. TOT doesn't actually have nearly as many high correlating factors as some of the other revenue categories. But I do wonder if you have a higher income in a county as a whole, it typically means that you have higher paying jobs. It typically means that you have a higher amount of economic activity in general, which also typically means that you have a much more hotel activity and business travel as well. So if that's the case, that's really where our assumption would be in terms of how personal income would actually correlate to an increase in TOT tax, but it takes a little bit to get there.
No, that makes sense to me now. So I appreciate that explanation. And then just a couple of other two more questions. So our employment data showed that only 24.6% of Palo Alto employees in Palo Alto live in Palo Alto. And I'm curious if we have data as far as regional state trends of what is normal for a percentage of a workforce to live in the same city.
Nick or Isaac, did you come across that in your research?
I did not. Nick.
I did not. I think it was, Marta, wasn't that something that your group came up with?
It was, yes. And the answer is no, we didn't look at other statewide data or comparables, but I think that was my question as well. I mean, it was outside the scope of this project, but if you looked at other Bay Area communities, I would guess you'd see similar commuting data for those employment centers. I mean, you guys have a huge employment center, but obviously there are others right nearby. So I think, you guys are so unique in the country, but your peer communities are right next to you. So yeah, I would think you'd find something similar, but we did not look at that.
Okay, yeah, that's something I think that would be really helpful to have that data point to compare to. And also I would imagine that larger cities are might skew that data if we're looking at it at a county-wide or regionally. I'd imagine large cities like San Jose and San Francisco are going to have more people working in and living in the city just by the pure size of it, but would be helpful to know if we can get that, especially down to the actual individual city level. And then just one final question. The report talked about creating experiences in downtown and California Avenue. And I'm wondering, and Kyle, I know you're always in our meetings, so you might be able to speak to this. Is that consistent with the recent direction by council to explore permanent closure of Cal Ave and redesign that street? I mean, is that sort of kind of in line with what you were envisioning when that part was written?
So the short answer is yes. The longer answer is that, we wrote many statements that include, I forget the exact language, but essentially considerations. So we're not definitively making the recommendation that you do that, but rather in communities like Palo Alto, the emphasis is typically on, there's probably a better economic development term, but sort of experiences, experiential things in the city, and that would certainly align to it. So yes, in short, but we weren't specifically recommending that you do that.
Yeah, no, understood. Thank you. Those are all my questions. Councilmember Tanaka?
Yeah, I also have to thank you guys. I thought this report was extremely interesting. I love that you guys did it. It's the first time I've ever seen something like this, so this is great. I think it's something we want to continue. So thank you guys for your work on this. I was wondering if the city auditor, you showed me something during our 101, and I can't find that table. I don't know if you could share your screen or tell me where in the report that table was that you showed me of the 5-year. I think, do you know what I'm referring to?
Yeah, so a component of what I shared with you is on packet page 13, and 13. I have found the packet pages. So thanks, Councilmember Cormack, for being patient with me for a few moments there. But council packet page 13 compares projected revenues versus actual revenues over a 5-year period.
13.
The
on 13,
other items that,
wait, hold on. On 13, my packet page 13 is the last item. Am I looking at the wrong packet page? So this is talking about the bills from the last item. So I don't know if that's packet page 13 or what page it is, but I'm probably on the wrong page.
Sure, Councilmember Tanaka, I think that the packet pages are slightly different because we added the first item to this report subsequent to the release of this. So let me try and help navigate this. Mr. O'Rourke, you're talking about?
what's our page 7 of the economic recovery analysis report?
I believe that's packet page 26, the one that's posted online on city website.
Sorry, right after I said thank you for bearing with me, and now I'm totally lost. But our page 7 sounds like packet page 26. At the bottom of the page is a table that compares 5 years of projections with actual revenues. And this shows the delta of, roughly, on average of 4 or 5% per year.
Sure. No, I thought there was another table that you showed me and I couldn't find that one.
Yeah, so you had asked a question in one of our one-on-ones, and I shared with other council members the projections 3 years out and 5 years out.
Yeah.
And what that showed, and I'm going to generalize here, but the projections 3 years out were
Can you just
generally.
bring up the graph again, if is that possible? Okay, maybe as you bring up the graph, I'll continue on. So I guess so I just guys, this preface is actually my day job is actually doing a lot of forecasting. So I build a lot of machine learning models around forecasting. So this is also why I really nerded out on this topic. But I think one thing that I liked that you did on the graphs was you guys had the R squared, right? So you show how well did the model fit, and some of the models fit really well. You have a R squared of 0.9 or higher, which is really nice. Some of them were not good, right? Some of them are like 0.5, like kind of marginal type of fit. So, but I think in general, it's a good idea always to when you actually get the actual results to compare against the forecast and use that as a way to use that as feedback to improve the model. So I'm not sure if staff is already doing that, or is that something that you guys haven't thought of doing before? I don't know who does the forecasting. I have to say, whoever does, can someone answer that?
I'm sorry, Councilmember Tanaka, can you repeat the question?
Oh yeah. So I noticed on this in the report, some of the graphs when it was trying to fit the line, right, the forecast line to the actuals, it had the R squared, which is great. And one of the best practices in forecasting actually is to look at the actual results. So when you make a forecast, you look at what the forecast was and look at the actual, and you see what the error is. And by understanding that, you're able to use that as feedback to make the model better, right? Because sometimes there might be a systematic bias up or systematic bias down, or maybe you're thinking the trend's linear, but it's really not, right? So there's lots of different things you could do. And so I don't know if staff has already done that as part of the practice. I didn't quite see that in recommendations, but it's generally, best practice is to look at the error, right? Look at the actual against the forecast and look at the error to see how that was against the actual forecast.
Councilmember Tanaka, yes, when we do revise annually our forecast, we always compare actuals to what our last forecast was and those projections.
Okay. Yeah, well, that's great. I think you definitely should if you haven't already. That's great. Mr. Walker, is this what you showed me? I don't think so. I think it was like a spreadsheet or something. I forgot what it was.
Yeah, I have. I can share. I'm not sure who's sharing right now. I pulled the snippet, just the most digestible part. The version that you saw had columns above that had the details.
Yeah, This
is comparing, I guess, just for everybody. I know I sent this to council members, but what we did, and this is quick, we have the data and we were talking about it in one-on-one meeting. So we took the long-range financial plan projection 5 years out and compared it to the actuals 5 years later, and similar with 3-year difference. Our projection for FY15 would have been comparing the long-range financial plan that was completed in FY10 versus the actuals in FY15 for the year FY15. Hopefully I explained that well. It sounded a little bit more confusing coming out of my mouth, but I think Councilmember Tanaka, I think what sort of what you're referring to is when we look at these numbers, leaving out maybe the COVID years, what we can see is a trend that 5 years out, we're roughly 15% or so off the mark and directionally the same. Whereas 3 years out, we might be 10 or 12% off, directionally the same. I think your question maybe is whether or not there's like statistical adjustments that could be made to those long-range financial plans just for purposes of being more accurate in the long-range financial plan. I don't know if I'm misquoting you.
Yeah, exactly. So this is what I saw you showed me, and I was trying to find it in the packet. So thank you for bringing it up. And so this is what I was talking about, right? So if you look at the forecast error, it's a fairly consistent error every single year. And one simple way to fix it is to bias it, right? So there's at least between what you want to do is you want to center the error, right? So you want to be consistently above all the time or consistently below all the time. So one common technique to actually fix the forecast is simply to bias it, right? So for the 5-year, right, maybe there should have been a 12% bias, right? And that would have centered the error. So rather than having an error, that's consistently, between 10 to 17%, putting aside the COVID years, that would have provided council more accuracy in terms of what the forecast really is. And same thing with the 3-year, right? There could have been a bias there, and that's why I was asking if you guys compare, because if you do compare and you kind of put this, you factor this into your forecast model, you would come up with a better model. The model would be more accurate, and this is kind of the thing that made me think about it. I don't know. I feel like we're losing you guys.
Well, no, I don't want to speak on Christine's behalf, but if I were in their position, I would be focused on the 1 year out. You're ramping up towards the budgeting process, and my response to this would be, we're mostly focused on those 1 year projections. Want the 5 and 10 year, 3-5 year rather years to be as accurate as possible, but the input really is to the budgeting process.
Yeah,
not sure if that's the perspective they take, but that could be part of it.
Well, my only pushback is that I mean, we could tell by looking at this that a bias factor could have helped, and this could have made it more accurate. Another thing that's kind of weird here, which is really interesting, is if you look at the forecast distance, so as you go further out, it's harder to forecast, right? So a 5-year forecast is not going to be as good as a 3-year forecast, or 1 year out forecast. Even 1 year forecast would be very accurate because it's just next year. But one thing that's also really interesting here is that there's still quite a bit of variation in the 3-year forecast. And also you don't have the 1 year forecast on here as well, but also quite a bit on the 1 year forecast. So it looks like there's an opportunity to perhaps get a little more accuracy on the forecast model than you guys are currently doing right now.
Thank you, Councilmember Tanaka, for those comments. One of the things too that we factor in, and we can definitely do more of this analysis in our modeling, is just taking a quick snip of what Mr. O'Rourke had on the screen. If I'm correct, we had projections for 2015 and 2018, and we were off by 10%. And if those projections were estimated in 2010, we had no idea that we would have 2 ballot measures for TOT, for instance. So those would be reasons and explanations for potential differences that we would take into account in this type of analysis. So just putting that out there is another layer that we do consider in our modeling.
Yeah, good point.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course, thank you. The other thing I noticed is, and I don't know if this is true, but it looked like only linear models were used. Is that right? Or are you guys using non-linear models as well for the forecasting? At least in the report, I only saw linear models.
The trend lines were all linear. That's correct.
Okay, because I would argue that some of them definitely are linear, especially the ones with a 0.9 or higher R-squared. But some of the trends, let me see if I can find it here. Let's see here. I'm trying to flip through this thing. No, I can't find it, but there's one with like a fairly low R-squared, which probably a different type of trend line would have been a better fit. So I don't know how you guys are trying to do your forecast model, but sometimes things are not linear. Oh, yeah, I know the TOT revenue. That's the one which is a 0.68 R-squared. That's maybe not a linear model, right?
Right. When we looked at some of those, we did look at other models, the polynomial models and the exponential models. What we found was there's so much variability in the revenue streams that there wasn't a good fit in any of the trends we tried to put into it. That's why we looked at the historical 10-year, historical 5-year, historical 20-year. We looked at data in a lot of different ways to try and put it up on the screen and say what makes a logical way to project these forward, because there's such variability. And then you have some of those revenues that change because of ordinance changes, and that building, that the amount of variability is so extreme. But we did look at the other regression analyses in addition to the linear. They didn't seem to produce results that were getting us in that 0.9 and above in any of the cases.
Yeah.
And so,
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, and so we left the regression, the linear ones in there because the other ones did present significantly better outcomes.
Yeah. So I think, and they actually had this in the auditors put this in the recommendations, but using additional features, right? Like, what is the daytime population, right? Or I forgot exactly what words they used, but basically I think some additional features would probably have informed the model a little bit better.
Yeah, and that's why we try things like, tied to personal income, or were there any correlations that seem to fit in there that we could then use forward projections from the state and congressional budget office, the Fed Reserve, to give a little better outcome. And it's, as you know, it's not exact science, so you kind of step back and say what seems to fit best long term, and where would if I was projecting this and don't have to hang my hat on it, what projection would I feel most comfortable with? So there's some personal interpretation built into it. We tended to be a little conservative in that regard because we would rather, be somewhat under-report than have some projections where the actual historical trends were exponential and had growth that we didn't believe you could actually sustain.
Yeah.
So it's a judgment call in many ways, but it would be an interesting conversation to look at those models with you and, and see, is there a better way to get there? Because obviously, there's a lot of ways to look at that, and people have different perspectives. Sometimes say, why didn't we think of it that way? But we did look at it, everyone, in 8 or 9 different dimensions to try and come up with something that seemed to make the most sense.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. I guess, I guess my thoughts are that, is that I would say that, I would start, like you're doing right now, start really simple, then kind of work your way up and add more features a little bit at a time and see how that affects things. But for something like TOT, I would think employment in the area, business activity in the area, those are kind of probably key features, but you could probably figure that out through some sort of correlation analysis. But anyways, I'm happy if you're interested to talk to you more about this, because I actually know quite a bit about forecasting, so happy to try to help where I can. Last item here is
Councilmember Tanaka, just if you could just make it brief, because we are
Yeah,
approaching
no, I
the
understand.
2-hour mark and we're only halfway through the agenda.
Okay, good point. And can someone just send me the Hoover Institute report that someone mentioned?
It's actually linked in the
Okay.
report. I forget which page, but you could Control F Hoover and I think it pops up.
Sounds good. Thank you.
And to complete, yes, I'm an engineer, so I love mathematics.
All right, wonderful. Anyone like to make be entertaining motions? I know staff is requesting that we simply accept the report and forward it to council.
I'll move the staff report.
And I'll second. Thank you. Would you like to speak to your motion?
I spoke extensively earlier. I think again, the lenses here, the correlations, the splitting out of residential and commercial on the property tax, these are all things that are going to help us, interpret the work that our staff does even better going forward.
Thank you. And yeah, I have nothing to add to my second. And then if there's no further discussion on the motion, clerk, if you can call the vote.
Councilmember Tanaka,
Yes.
Chair Stone,
Yes.
Councilmember Cormack,
Yes.
motion passes unanimously.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Moving now to item number 3 on our agenda, presentation of the fiscal year 22 risk assessment report and audit plan.
Yeah, so give me one moment and I'll share my screen. I'll also say as I'm sharing my screen. Thanks to everyone that you saw from our team. They're probably going to drop off now. Not too many introductions. I think folks said their name, but sort of an eclectic group of folks actually. Nick and Isaac Bales are sort of our financial analysis experts, and Nick actually prepares budgets on behalf of local government. So he comes from that perspective. Isaac actually is a former municipal advisor. So he has a strong financial analysis background. And then Marta, who joined us for a couple of the questions, is one of our economic development consultants. So thanks to our team for joining, and you all can drop off. And sorry for the post introduction. So the next item on the agenda is the presentation of our risk assessment report and audit plan. So there's 2 reports with this item as well. This slide deck is going to be very similar to those of you that were involved last year, similar to what we presented last year. We'll go through kind of our process, some risk areas, we'll dive into the audit plan, and then jump to questions thereafter. So talking a little bit about process. In our first year, we did an extensive number of interviews. So in that phase 2 information gathering phase, we interviewed nearly 30 people, members of executive leadership, as well as council members and other folks that were interested in speaking with us. Our process this year was a little bit different. We interviewed kind of key executive leadership team members. So really folks like the city manager, Ms. Nose, as well as kind of key functions that represent significant risks. Human resources, given the labor environment, information technology, but we did not interview every single member of executive leadership. So the change this year is that we actually enhanced our process by including a survey, that bolded item there, as part of our information gathering process. So what you'll see in the report is a lot of, at least at the beginning of the risk assessment report, are a lot of indications of survey results. Our analysis phase was fairly similar. We document auditable areas. You can essentially see all of that in the back end of our risk assessment report, that matrix. And we went through a scoring process, and you can see some of the updates we made to the risk assessment this past year. And then, of course, we move into this reporting phase, which we've had written reports as well as the verbal. So just a little bit of background on risks. When we think about risks as auditors, we're thinking of risks at an organizational wide level, but then also all the way down into specific functions. So the risk types we consider are financial, which is maybe traditionally what you'd think an auditor would be looking at. So internal controls, mathematical accuracy types of issues. We also consider operational risks. So for example, things in public works or engineering that are more day-to-day operations. We're considering technology, so that includes cybersecurity as kind of the big hot topic. We're thinking about fraud, waste, and abuse. We're thinking about strategic risks, so whether or not our operations are aligned to our strategic objectives, for example, compliance and reputation. So a broad array of risks is essentially the point here. When we document all of the risk areas, again, that matrix that you see in the back end of the report, we then go through a process of scoring risks. And we score them based on likelihood and impact. Likelihood being the probability of an event occurring, impact being the financial or other measure of impact of an adverse event taking place. And so we define those within the report. And when we put those two together, we end up with an overall risk rating. As part of that process, we want to make sure we right size our risk scoring to Palo Alto. So for example, we wouldn't want to consider a $50 million capital project as being, moderate or low risk. Whereas if you were a multi-billion-dollar transit organization, we might consider that a lesser risk. So really making sure that the risk scoring is right-sized for a city like Palo Alto. Just some kind of key considerations. This is a little bit of a hodgepodge of notes here, but one big overall note is that the risk matrix is not we're not expressing any conclusions. Rather, we're really rating risks for the purposes of identifying auditable areas. And so we intentionally use the words examples of potential risk. Those are not things that are actually going wrong. Those are things that could hypothetically go wrong. And they're also not, the full laundry list of everything that could go wrong, but just common examples. Helps us sort of in the risk scoring process. So again, not drawing conclusions necessarily from this report. It's just an input for our audit planning process. And then a little bit of orientation. On the back end of the report, you see sort of 3 subsections of risks. You'll see what we call environment, strategy, and governance. Really, those are organizational wide concerns. Culture, strategy being examples. Then we dive into major projects and initiatives. And typically these involve significant outlays of cash or capital. So these are capital projects, or could be other large projects or initiatives, like for instance, an ERP system implementation that requires significant effort or investment. And then lastly, you see function specific risks. This is where we really lay out the full organization of the government department by department, and then dive deeper into each function to assess risks there. In total, we identify 154 auditable areas, which literally means there's 154 rows within the matrix, again, on the appendix of that report. And then actual audits that can be conducted are a multiple of that. We're talking hundreds of audits. We could design multiple for each row or each auditable area. And then, of course, the primary purpose is to inform the audit plan. The second report we'll cover here in a second. We have on the screen right now, and this is also in the report, a distribution of the risk scoring. This is pretty typical, where we see 10 to 15% of risks in the high category, and generally a skew like you see here. If we see a skew in either direction, positively or negatively, that might indicate that we have a little bit of a scoring challenge, and or simply haven't identified all auditable areas. So just, there's no hard or fast rule on risk scoring, but sort of a good overall starting point for evaluating risks. So that's our risk assessment report. Jumping into the audit plan itself, how do we develop the audit plan, I guess, is where I want to start. First and foremost, we use the risk assessment, the results we just discussed. That's a significant contributor to whether or not an area makes it to the audit plan. Secondly, we also consider the ability for the city auditor to add value. There's certain items that might be simply political decisions that need to be made, operational day-to-day things that staff are responsible for, and therefore might not be the appropriate place for the city auditor to conduct a project. Of course, I and the city auditor department in general report to city council, so we want to make sure that we're listening to and aligning to council direction. The fourth bullet here, audit coverage. We really want to consider what audits have been conducted in the past. So that's actually prior audits. But also we want to kind of give a little bit of thought in terms of how audits are spread around functional areas. We wouldn't want to come to you with a year where we're recommending 12 IT audits. That would simply be unreasonable and actually maybe put the IT department at more risk rather than less by conducting all that work. So considering where we're spending our time as a component, or consideration rather. Ripeness. So is it the right time? We want to consider timing of an audit. We wouldn't want to conduct an ERP system implementation audit potentially in the midst of it, but maybe rather it's something to conduct afterwards to identify further areas of remediation. So really ripeness of the project. And lastly, scheduling. Of course, if something is high risk, we might not consider this to a great extent. But simple example, we don't want to schedule payroll field work during a payroll week. Not a great example, but I guess gets the point home. There's certain busy times for certain functions during the year, so we want to consider that in our scheduling. A little bit of orientation to this report. So it's a requirement of the city auditor to develop an audit plan. What you see is a plan that goes through the end of fiscal year 2023. So we're recommending, I guess that would be 15 to 16 months of audit activities that will take us through the end of next fiscal year. And with the intent at that point of aligning our audit planning process to the fiscal year. So we'd conduct the next risk assessment before the end of fiscal year 2023, and it would lay out audits for fiscal year 2024. The last sub bullet under the first major bullet here, the ability to be agile. So what you see in your plan is what we're calling phases. Phase 1 is actually audits that are already underway that will be conducted or finished over the coming months. Phase 3, sort of the other end of the spectrum, are audits that will begin and exclusively conducted within next fiscal year. However, I guess I want to point out that we're putting the plan in front of you today, and if there's new risks, new issues, new challenges, any compelling reason to change the plan, we have the ability to be agile in our work, both in terms of how we, the city auditor, and our team present and propose changes to the audit plan during the year, but also we bring forth task orders throughout the year. So you have the ability to manage our work in the future through approval of task orders. So this is the point being, this is the plan we believe should be in place today. And if we need to make changes throughout the next year and a half, we'll work with you to do that. Audit activity. This is a generic term that I use for every project that we do. They're audit activities. You might hear audit, you might hear review, you might hear assessment. I tend to use the word audit activity. So just want to make sure you all are aware that is intentional. And we talked about task order approval. We're asking, along with approval of the plan today, we're asking for approval of 3 task orders for audits that we'd like to begin here soon. So I talked a little bit about the phases. Phase 1 activities, you've already approved those task orders. Those are already underway. Some of them, well, actually, Economic Recovery Advisory, for example, was presented today and will be fully complete when presented to council. Phase 2, we're actually asking for approval of all 3 of those projects, projects that we hope to complete before the end of this fiscal year, if not early in fiscal year 2023. And then phase 3 are activities to be completed entirely next year. So I'm going to focus, I've not included phase 1 in the presentation at all. Those are already underway. You've already approved the task orders. I don't plan to walk through those. I'm happy to answer questions if we need to, but for purposes of the presentation, I've skipped right to phase 2. Those check marks on the left indicate that we're asking for approval of the task orders. So for all 3 of these phase 2 activities. The first project really is intended to take a look at flexible and remote work that city employees are able to do and offer recommendations for the future. So really adapting to the new labor environment and offering best practices to do that. The second item is a cybersecurity assessment. So as you may recall, we did an overarching review of IT risk management practices. This project dives a level deeper and we look at actual cybersecurity control matters. So diving deeper and really taking a look at cyber specifically, not the overarching IT risk management framework. And then lastly, this audit was actually deferred, was one of the changes that we made in last year's plan in the middle of the year, and deferred, but we believe the project is ripe now, and we want to sort of evaluate the cost allocation mechanisms for allocating costs for the water treatment plant to the various parties involved and ensure compliance with the various agreements. I don't plan on going through each of these. And in fact, this slide is a little stressful, lots of words. Happy to answer any questions and jump back to this if you'd like. But as you can see, we've got a couple of IT projects, a couple projects that touch finance, including a procurement process, audit activity, and then a couple of others focused on long-range planning and ADA compliance projected as well. So that sort of concludes the presentation. I have now just the recommended motion, which is in the staff report, but I went through a lot. Essentially what we're looking for is approval of the risk assessment report, the audit plan report, and the 3 task orders that are included in the council packet. I'm happy to answer any questions and participate in a discussion.
Great, thank you, Mr. O'Rourke. As always, very thorough report. Let's go to the public to see if we have any public comments.
Chair, no hands are raised and no members of the public have requested to speak. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Then I'll open it up to my colleagues. And just a reminder, if we can try to keep our comments to range like 5 to 10 minutes, especially since we're past 9 now. Thank you. So any hands? All right. If not, I have a couple questions. Then just a couple, because such a thorough report again. One, I was curious: is it common practice for cities to not shut off utilities in the event of regularly missed payments? I can't recall what page that's on. My apologies, but
You repeat the question.
Yeah, I was just wondering, because the report talked about that the Palo Alto, we do not shut off utilities if a customer has missed several payments, and talked about some maybe long-term concerns about that. And I'm curious, is that common practice for other jurisdictions to also do the same that Palo Alto does?
I think it's location specific and also sort of potentially dependent upon economic circumstances. I would say, if we were likely if we were to make a best practice recommendation, it would be that you do disconnect at some point if utility user payments are not made. That point sort of differs by community. And in all likelihood, there's sort of economic hardship programs established so that those folks can go on payment plans or the like, as a means of lessening the burden of a significant one-time payment.
Okay, that's good. And in Palo Alto in particular, and I don't know if your audit really dove into this, but does it appear to be a particular problem in Palo Alto of utility customers not paying bills? It was just referenced, but with no real kind of concrete data on that.
I do not believe this is a significant concern.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, it seems like it seems like something we might need to consider in the future if that does become a major issue. But yeah, that just kind of stuck out to me. And then you kind of talked about it already, but just as far as the phase 3, then I assume that at a future date we're going to be getting this. It's going to be kind of same presentation you just did with asking for authority for phase 3.
Yes, and I will take you one step further, actually. In speaking with a couple of other council members, sort of in one-on-one conversations, they've expressed a desire for this sort of report to be discussed in a full council meeting. What I've suggested in response to that is that we move forward with approval of this. Ideally, we receive all of your support and it would go on a consent agenda item. And then my offer would be at a later point when there's ample space on an agenda packet, we would do just that, with the purposes of getting in front of the public, making sure that the broader public are seeing the work of the city auditor, but also, to your point, discussing some of the phase 3 activities. So yes, we would like to do that and potentially do it in a full council setting. And I would say too, and actually I don't believe any of the 3 of you suggested, but just in one-on-one conversations in the last couple of weeks, it seems like there might be a desire to reprioritize some of those phase 3 activities with other audits. So I'm already prepared that there's going to be changes for this. It might not be for several months, but we'll definitely make sure that we bring it back through the appropriate channels to discuss the phase 3 audits, certainly before we get to task orders.
Great, thanks. And those are my questions. I just a couple of thoughts. I mean, I did find it interesting that the long commute and the cost of living was only about 3.1% of those weaknesses or threats that managers identified. I think anecdotally and just kind of a general opinion seems to be that those two things are major impediments to retention and recruitment and just general concerns, not only of city employees, but also just employees in general in Palo Alto. So I was kind of surprised to see that concern was ranked so low amongst the managers. And maybe that just goes to show too, how important the other concerns are that they were raising. And I think just very, very clear that the increasing workload and workforce reduction having a clear impact on staff. I think that's something that all of us on council need to be constantly reminded of. I know every Monday we tend to add more and more onto the plate of staff, and I know I'm guilty of that as well. And so kind of I think we just kind of constantly are getting reminded of that. So I think until we can, they definitely kind of reminds us too the importance of continuing with retention efforts and recruitment efforts to be able to address that and being cognizant of that in the meantime on staff and their bandwidth. Councilmember Cormack.
Thank you, Chair Stone, and thank you to Mr. O'Rourke and his whole team for doing this. I appreciate you emphasizing the bullet that risk assessment is an annual activity. It's a conversation we had at the CAO meeting earlier today, where I'm pleased to report that the CAO did recommend that a similar budget in FY23. This is referenced on page 2 of it, so I just want to reassure my colleagues that's the intention as recommended. I do have a number of detailed comments on this. I don't know how detailed the review has been in the past. First, maybe just an overall question. What changes did you see in this risk assessment vis-a-vis last year's? What things changed?
Most significant change is the discussion around labor. So Councilmember Stone sort of pointed this out, but many of the labor-related matters sort of rose to the high-risk area. So workload being one of them, the COVID-19 response, health and safety continuing to be at the top, but really labor-related concerns gravitating towards the top. I think that's most significant. A second item that sort of became a recurring conversation, and the scoring sort of showed it, was procurement. And we've heard a variety of questions around procurement, but some of them compliance related, some of them process efficiency related, but really just the ability to work through the process quickly, efficiently, and effectively sort of rose to the top. I think those are probably the two primary ones. Of course, information technology, there's things that are always at the top. And we hope over the years to sort of check those boxes as we go and make sure we're covering the highest risk areas, but no change necessarily to scoring.
That's super helpful. I didn't go back and do a crosswalk, but I was stunned. I'm on now, I guess I have to add 13 pages to my packet page numbers. So I'm on page 5 of the survey results, which I guess would be packet page 83 for anyone following along at home, or electronically, just stunned by the emphasis on people, both on the strength side and on the concern side. And it just flowed all the way through, on the changes and barriers, right? It was quite remarkable. So I think that's an important point for us to take away from all this. When I look at the risk scoring page, so that's your page 10, and I think page 86 electronically, obviously they're all the red ones, so we're all going to freak out about those, but, or at least I am. But it was interesting for me, and I just like you to talk through a little bit the scoring on, let's just say the 7 below those, or 8 or so that have a low likelihood. But again, the likelihood is only a 2-year score, right? It's likelihood in the next 2 years. Is that what one of the footnotes said?
I'm going to forget my timelines here. I believe that's accurate. Sorry, I'm pulling this up. Yeah, so 2 is, an adverse event. It's possible within a 2-year period.
Yeah. I just worry about some of the ones that, like, is there a number higher than 5 for an impact? Like if our wastewater treatment plant isn't functioning. So I appreciate the detailed scoring that's gone into it, but I encourage my colleagues to take a look at, the top of the orange area, just because based on the, it may not happen in the next 2 years, but the impact on that is significant. And some of them do show up later in the phase 3 of the audit plan. So I appreciate that. So the next comment is, now I'm going to read my reading glasses because you got really small font on some of these things here. Now I'm down in the detailed plan on, I guess, page 32. And if I give you the risk ID 71, investments, is that on the list for phase 3? Yes, investment management. Okay, good. That's something we've been talking about, in finance for the past couple of years, and thinking about how should we be investing various portions of our, particularly our Section 115 trust. So I'm going to really appreciate having you all participate in helping us make those decisions wisely to the extent that that's appropriate. And then I'm really stunned. I don't know if we have anyone from HR here today, but an awful lot of comments. Looks like number risk ID 90, risk ID 97. We still have a manual performance review process. We don't have a centralized repository for employee records. Ms. Nose, didn't we put some money in the budget at some point in the past year or two to help with that? I think we did. And I'm not really looking for an answer tonight, just to flag, for staff to chat with HR. Like, it concerns me when I see that. I feel like we're in 2022. We should be far beyond that, especially for a city like us. So thanks for flagging those in the process. And then the last one I wanted to talk about is on page, let's see, I got 99, looks like. Let me try page 105, which is my page numbers, which will be, oh yeah, this is disaster. So risk ID 118, and that is captured in phase 3 with the disaster recovery preparedness. So that's helpful. Okay, so now just turning to the audit plan itself, which is page 119, and looking at the ones that are proposed for this evening. Absolutely remote and flexible work study. It's just, I hesitate to say it's obvious, but it's obvious. And I don't know that we will find best practices. It's a little bit like the comment that Mayor Burt made last night about SCAP, our climate action plan. Like, there aren't predecessors. There aren't other people who have figured out how to do some of this, but perhaps we'll find some interesting things. Cybersecurity, for sure. We have a bunch of IT ones to work through. And then definitely wastewater treatment plan agreement audit. That's just, important business. And it's super important for us to do that now before we start implementing, 5 significant capital improvement projects, one of which is really going to cost, a significant amount of money. So we need to make sure those things are accurate to the hundreds, not guesstimates. So thank you so much. And when the time comes, I'll be happy to make the staff recommendation.
Great. Just one point of clarification. I don't believe HR is represented today, and I can't fully speak to this, but a couple of the items that you mentioned that were HR specific, I believe actually are intended to be addressed by phase 2 of the SAP upgrade, which is currently underway, at least the scoping of it is. So some of the leverage ability to leverage technology will be addressed through that upgrade process. Not sure if specifically on the couple items you mentioned, but definitely on some of the broader challenges within HR.
Okay, well, that's reassuring. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Councilmember Tanaka, do you have any questions or comments?
No, we could go for it.
All right, sounds good. Councilmember Cormack, you said you wanted to make the motion?
I would be happy to move the recommendation that the staff prepared, which is to recommend City Council approval of the risk assessment report, the audit plan report, and the task orders for work, remote and flexible work study, cybersecurity assessment, wastewater treatment plant agreement audit.
I'll second. Would you like to speak to your motion?
We had high hopes when we did the RFP for a new city auditor. And I think those high hopes have been met based on the consistent and detailed work that we've been provided this evening.
Couldn't agree more. Those are all my comments. Councilmember Tanaka, do you want to say anything to the motion? Nope. All right, wonderful. Then if the clerk can call the vote.
Chair Stone,
Yes.
Councilmember Cormack,
Yes.
Councilmember Tanaka,
Yes.
motion passes unanimously.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, everybody. Brings us to our very last action item, presentation of the Office of the City Auditor Quarterly Status Report.
Great. Thanks for bearing with me. Quite a lot of audit work tonight. This one is the easiest to get through, and you can see the staff report is 2 pages or less, if I recall. So the city auditors were, or as part of our contract rather, were required to provide a quarterly update. This one covers the period ended 12/31. You'll get another one that'll cover the period ending 3/31 here in roughly 6 or 8 weeks. So we'll keep these coming. The format of this is pretty similar to what you've seen in the past. An overview of scope. So you just reviewed the audit plan, which as well as the risk assessment, you reviewed the risk assessment and audit plan. So tasks 1 and 2 you're familiar with. Task 3 deals with the city auditor's work as a liaison to the financial auditor. So that's a separate task that we're undergoing. The audit plan, task 4 is execution of the audit plan. So those are all the task orders that we receive approval on and then execute actual projects. Task 5 actually encompasses these quarterly updates, the annual update, and other sort of administrative tasks for the city auditor's office. And task 6 is associated with the evaluation of the peer review rather of the city auditor office. Just providing some updates. As you just discussed, we've sought approval for both the risk assessment report and the audit plan. That second item is inaccurate, but the audit plan report today. So that's our update there. And we previously, for last fiscal year, in the time allotted, had sought approval roughly a year ago. The financial audit, within the period, we solicited proposals from audit firms. Councilmember Cormack, as formerly member of the Finance Committee, was part of that process. We evaluated those firms, and we're currently undergoing contract negotiations to get that firmed up for audit work beginning roughly a month from now. And that will be coming to council. And during this time, we also presented the results of the fiscal year 21 audit. And we did that in conjunction with the administrative services folks. In terms of task 4, all of this is listed out in the staff report, and I've linked up all of the reports. There's quite a lot here, but City Council has fully approved 3 audit reports, or did during this period rather. Policy and Services reviewed an additional 3 audits during this period that were to be presented to council during this quarter that we're currently in. And you also approved 1 task order, or rather council did, for the wire payment process audit. So that was all completed last quarter. In terms of the sort of periodic reporting, hotline monitoring task, we've continued to monitor hotline reports. As you'll see here, there weren't any the last quarter. We delivered our annual report, sort of covering the first year of Baker Tilly's engagement with the city. And then part of this is our ongoing attendance at city council meetings, executive leadership meetings, agenda planning meetings, and so forth. And then lastly, we're planning for a forthcoming peer review, ensuring that sort of we have our ducks in a row and we're coordinating with ALGA on that matter, the Association of Local Government Auditors, that is. Some kind of key metrics, reports issued. These are, we consider a report sort of finalized and issued when it's fully approved by council. So economic recovery, for example, would not fall in this category. That actually falls in the audit activities in progress until it's fully approved by council. So we actually have 2 reports right now that will fall into that separate category here shortly, and several others underway, which we can see on this slide. So these are all the task orders that you've completed under that execution of the audit plan task. Bolded items are audit activities that are underway, and you can see some detailed notes on where those stand. And then the crossed off items are the ones for which council has fully approved the reports. Just a couple of standouts. Economic recovery advisory was covered earlier. So task 4.7 will go to council here soon. Task 4.6 was reviewed by policy and services, I believe in January, and is going in a couple of weeks to council. So that one will be crossed off here in a couple of weeks. The public safety building, you've reviewed the first memo. It will remain bold until completed, but we will continue to issue those memos over time. So that's just an ongoing audit, will always be bold. And then when we get to 4.9, 4.10, 4.11, 4.12, those are sort of the most recent to have started audit activities, and those reports will start coming out here as well. And then lastly, task 4.5 is one that is actually deferred, but now is being considered under that phase 3 of the new audit plan. So lots of audit activities in the works, and happy to dive into more of the details if you'd like. One of our responsibilities is to monitor the fraud, waste, and abuse hotline. There's sort of a committee, myself, the city manager, and the city attorney, who receive all reports. In prior periods, we'd received and closed multiple reports. In the most recent several periods, as you can see here, we have not received any reports from the hotline. So no action has been needed. And that sort of concludes our sort of standard quarterly update. I will say there was discussion in the council appointed officer meeting earlier today of a desire to have more sort of KPIs or metrics associated with our work. So we're happy to recommend some at future meetings, and maybe what we'll do is we'll provide a few additional KPIs in future reports, so you have numbers and figures to look at. But just wanted to let you know that in all likelihood, these quarterly updates are the best place and point in time for us to report on key metrics. Some you've seen, like audits completed and hotline reports, but we can add to it over time. So on your screen right now and in the council packet, you can see our recommendation, but happy to answer any questions you might have.
All right, thank you again, Mr. O'Rourke. Let's go to public comment.
We have no hands raised, and we have no request to speak.
Great, thank you. Then I will open the floor to my colleagues. Councilmember Cormack.
If the chair is seeking motions,
Yes, please.
I would be happy to move that we accept the Office of the City Auditor's quarterly status report covering October through December of 2021.
I'll second.
And I do not need to speak to it.
I don't either, just beyond. Thank you, Mr. O'Rourke, and your entire team for all the work that you do. And you're always so friendly and approachable and professional, and just really appreciate everything you're doing for the city and the community. Councilmember Tanaka, would you like to speak to the motion? All right, hearing nothing, then can the clerk call the vote?
Councilmember Cormac,
Yes.
Chair Stone,
Yes.
Councilmember Tanaka,
Yes.
motion passes unanimously.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, that gets us through all of our action items. Mr. O'Rourke, thanks so much for sticking with us tonight and all your presentations. Then I believe what the next on our agenda, Ms. Con Gaines, is just a update on future agendas, correct?
Correct. And these items will continue to move around, but just a heads up of things on the horizon, I think I will describe it as additional auditor reports, the nonprofit agreement management report, as well as the SAP report. And then bringing a draft to this committee related to the council procedures and protocols document for your review. And we will also have some of the follow-ups related to renter protections that came as referrals from the city council in November. So just a heads up of things on the short horizon for us.
Great, thank you very much. And Councilmember Cormac.
Is there anything with the Neighbors Ambassador program coming up?
Yes, that is also on the
I
horizon.
think June, correct?
I think I have it in June.
Okay,
As
thank you.
estimated, yes. The good news is we have tons of business to take care of this year with the committee, and council will be discussing the work plans, and I'm sure we'll get a few other things our way. So we're just trying to balance it so we keep you all leaving at a reasonable hour and able to take care of all the items.
We appreciate it. All right, well, with that, thank you, everybody, for sticking with it tonight. That we will adjourn at 9:38 p.m. Have a wonderful night.